It all seemed like the whim of a crazy rich guy, until he tied a racehorse to the tracks of a high-speed train. But what the train driver did when he saw it shocked even the cops and sent this story spinning in a wild new direction. Hit that subscribe button now, because the ending, you won't believe it. The summer air hung thick over Willow Creek, Kentucky, a small town where the rhythmic clatter of passing trains had long been the soundtrack to generations of lives. Most residents had learned to sleep through the distant rumble, their dreams uninterrupted by the steel giants that traversed the tracks cutting through the eastern edge of their community. But on this particular night, as the clock tower struck 2, one man remained wide awake, his mind churning with an idea that would soon affect everyone around him. Harrison Blake stood at the window of his sprawling mansion, swirling a crystal glass of bourbon that cost more than what most Willow Creek residents earned in a month. At 45, he had everything money could buy: the finest clothes, the fastest cars, a collection of rare art that museums coveted, and a fortune that continued to multiply through investments most people couldn't comprehend. Yet, despite all his possessions, a profound emptiness had taken root in him, a void that grew larger with each passing day. "Mr. Blake," called a voice from the doorway, "is there anything else you need before I retire for the night?" Harrison didn't turn to acknowledge Walter, his longtime personal assistant. "No, Walter, you can go." When the door clicked shut, Harrison took a long sip of his bourbon and allowed himself a small, dangerous smile. Tonight would be different. Tonight, he would feel something again. Just beyond the manicured borders of his estate lay his prized possession, Victory Stride, a thoroughbred stallion whose lineage traced back to Triple Crown winners. The horse had earned Harrison millions in race purses and breeding fees, becoming almost a celebrity in equestrian circles. But to Harrison, Victory Stride had become something else entirely, a means to an experiment he'd been contemplating for weeks. Harrison made his way to the stables, where the night watchman had been given an unexpected night off with generous pay. The thoroughbred nickered softly as Harrison approached, recognizing his owner but unaware of what the night would bring. "Let's go for a ride, old friend," Harrison whispered, leading the magnificent animal out into the darkness. Across town, in a modest 2-bedroom house near the train yard, Thomas Walker was just returning home from his shift. At 38, Thomas had been operating trains for Southern Rail for nearly 15 years, a job he took immense pride in. The walls of his home were adorned with photos of his daughter, Emma, and various certificates recognizing his perfect safety record and dedication to the company. "Dad?" Emma's sleepy voice called from her bedroom as Thomas closed the front door. "Is that you?" "Yeah, sweetie. Sorry if I woke you," Thomas replied, setting down his lunchbox and work boots. "You should be asleep. You've got that science presentation tomorrow." Emma, 16 and wise beyond her years, appeared in the hallway wearing flannel pajamas. "I couldn't sleep. I was working on my notes." Thomas smiled at his daughter, the light of his life since his wife, Linda, had left them 5 years ago for a real estate agent from Louisville. "The presentation will be fine. You know that material better than your teacher does." Emma leaned against the wall, twirling a strand of auburn hair around her finger. "I just want to make sure I get that scholarship. NYU isn't going to pay for itself." "We'll figure it out," Thomas assured her, though the thought of college tuition kept him awake most nights. "Now go get some sleep. I've got the late shift again tomorrow, but I'll be home in time to hear all about how the presentation went." After Emma returned to her room, Thomas sank into his worn recliner and turned on the small television, keeping the volume low. The local news was just ending, with the anchor mentioning something about Harrison Blake donating a new wing to the county hospital. Thomas shook his head. Everyone in town knew Blake's charity was just for show, a tax write-off, for a man who had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. What Thomas didn't know, as he drifted off to sleep in his chair, was that Harrison Blake was at that moment leading Victory Stride along a secluded curve of the train tracks, to a spot where the trees grew thick on either side and visibility was poor for any approaching train. Harrison had spent weeks planning this moment. He'd studied the train schedules, identified the perfect location, and even practiced with the specialized knots he would use. The ropes in his hand were strong enough to secure a horse weighing over 1,000 pounds. "This isn't personal," Harrison murmured to the horse as he guided him onto the tracks. Victory Stride resisted at first, sensing danger in the metal rails beneath his hooves, but Harrison was skilled with animals and eventually coaxed him into position. With practiced efficiency, Harrison secured the thoroughbred to the tracks, using knots that would be nearly impossible for the animal to loosen. The horse grew increasingly agitated, but the ropes held firm. Harrison stepped back to assess his work, feeling a rush of adrenaline. This wasn't about hurting the horse. He'd calculated everything to ensure there would be time for rescue. This was about seeing how far people would go, what risks they would take for an animal. Harrison had privately wagered with a select group of equally wealthy friends. Some bet that no one would risk their life for a horse, while others argued that human sentimentality would prevail. The stakes were insignificant to men of their wealth, merely a way to add spice to the experiment. Checking his watch, Harrison noted that Thomas Walker's train would be approaching in approximately 45 minutes. Plenty of time for Harrison to reach his observation point, a small hill overlooking the tracks where he would watch the scene unfold through high-powered binoculars. As he settled into position, Harrison felt more alive than he had in years. Power hummed through him, the power to orchestrate human behavior, to test the limits of compassion and self-preservation. Would Walker stop the train? Would he risk everything for a horse? Across town, Thomas Walker was jolted awake by his alarm. His shift wasn't scheduled to start for another hour, but a colleague had called in sick, and the rail company had asked if he could cover. The extra pay would help with Emma's college fund, so Thomas had agreed without hesitation. As he quickly showered and changed into his uniform, Thomas had no idea that he was about to become the unwitting participant in Harrison Blake's twisted social experiment. He kissed his sleeping daughter's forehead before leaving, promising to be safe as he always did, a ritual that had become second nature over the years. The night air had cooled slightly as Thomas walked the short distance to the rail yard. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the tracks. Fellow workers nodded in greeting as Thomas made his way to Engine 457, the diesel locomotive he would be operating on the eastbound route through Willow Creek and beyond. "She's all fueled up and ready to go," said Mac, the yard supervisor, handing Thomas the manifest. "Should be a quiet night. Not much cargo, just the usual route." Thomas climbed into the locomotive's cabin, going through his pre-departure checklist with methodical precision. He ran his hands over the controls with the familiarity of someone who had spent more of his adult life in this seat than anywhere else. As the massive engine roared to life, Thomas felt the familiar surge of responsibility. Under his control was a machine weighing thousands of tons, capable of immense destruction if mishandled. But in Thomas's capable hands, it was a lifeline for the community, delivering goods, connecting people, and providing livelihoods for many Willow Creek families, including his own. The train pulled out of the yard right on schedule, beginning its journey through the sleeping town. Thomas settled into the rhythm of the rails, his mind drifting occasionally to Emma's presentation and how proud he was of her determination. Miles away, in the darkness beside the tracks, Victory Stride continued to struggle against his bindings, his instincts screaming danger while Harrison Blake watched from the shadows, waiting for the experiment to unfold. The train picked up speed as it cleared the town limits, its powerful headlight cutting through the darkness ahead. Thomas knew every inch of this route. every curve, every crossing, every landmark. But tonight, something unexpected waited around the bend, something that would test his reflexes, his courage, and his humanity in ways he could never have imagined. The locomotive thundered through the Kentucky countryside, its rhythmic clacking a familiar comfort to Thomas as he monitored the controls. The digital clock on the dashboard read 3:17 a.m., that peculiar hour when the world seemed suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. Thomas took a sip of coffee from his thermos, savoring the warmth as it spread through his chest. His mind wandered to Emma's future. The NYU brochures lay scattered across their kitchen table, each one a reminder of the financial mountain they would need to climb. Thomas earned a decent living, but not enough to cover Ivy League tuition without significant loans. Still, he would find a way. He always did. The radio crackled with routine updates from dispatch. Nothing unusual for this hour, Thomas responded. With his position report, his voice steady and professional. 15 years on the job had taught him to expect the unexpected, but tonight's run seemed destined to be uneventful. Until it wasn't. The train rounded a bend where the tracks curved gently through a thicket of oak and pine. Thomas's experienced eyes caught something unusual on the tracks ahead, a shape that didn't belong. At first, his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. The train's powerful headlight illuminated the scene in stark relief. A horse. No, not just any horse. A magnificent thoroughbred tied securely to the tracks. "What the hell?" Thomas muttered, instinctively reaching for the emergency brake. His heart slammed against his ribs as adrenaline flooded his system. Years of training kicked in as he calculated distances and braking time. The train, traveling at 68 miles per hour with its current load, would need at least half a mile to come to a complete stop. The horse was less than a quarter mile ahead. Thomas's hand closed around the brake handle and pulled with all his strength. The sudden deceleration sent a shudder through the entire train. The wheels screeched against the rails, a sound like metal being torn apart that echoed through the night. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the horse, which was now thrashing frantically against its restraints, clearly sensing the approaching danger. "Come on, come on!" Thomas urged the train, knowing full well that physics wasn't on his side. The massive machine fought against its own momentum, the distance between locomotive and horse shrinking with each passing second. As the train continued its desperate attempt to stop, Thomas caught movement in his peripheral vision. A figure standing on a small rise overlooking the tracks. Not someone rushing to help, but someone watching. In that instant, Thomas knew with cold certainty that this was no accident. Someone had deliberately put the horse in harm's way. The thought sickened him, even as he fought to maintain focus on the emergency at hand. The train was slowing, but not quickly enough. Thomas estimated they would still be moving at around 20 miles per hour when they reached the horse, more than enough speed to cause serious damage to both the animal and potentially the train. With seconds to spare, Thomas made a decision that went against every safety protocol he'd been taught. He engaged the independent brake on the locomotive while releasing the train line air brakes on the cars behind him. It was a dangerous maneuver that risked derailment, but it might buy those precious extra feet of stopping distance. The locomotive shuddered violently as the braking systems worked against each other. Warning alarms blared in the cabin. Thomas gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white with strain. The horse was now just yards away, its dark eyes wide with terror. By some miracle, or perhaps a testament to Thomas's skill, the train's speed had dropped to less than 5 miles per hour as it approached the horse. With a final metallic groan, the locomotive came to a stop, mere feet from the terrified animal. Thomas sat frozen for a moment, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then training gave way to instinct, and he was moving. He radioed dispatch with his location and a brief explanation, then grabbed his flashlight and emergency kit before jumping down from the cabin. The night air felt cool against his sweat-soaked skin as he approached the horse. The animal was magnificent, a thoroughbred with a glossy coat that gleamed even in the dim light. Its sides heaved with panicked breaths, muscles trembling beneath sleek hide. "Easy, easy," Thomas murmured, approaching slowly with his palm outstretched. "I'm not going to hurt you." The horse snorted, still pulling against the ropes that bound it to the rails. Thomas examined the knots with growing anger. These weren't simple restraints. They were complex, deliberately secure knots tied by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. As Thomas worked to free the horse, he became aware of being watched. Raising his flashlight, he scanned the hillside where he'd glimpsed the figure earlier. For a moment, the beam caught a reflection, perhaps from binoculars or glasses, before whoever was there retreated deeper into the shadows. "Who's there?" Thomas called out, his voice echoing in the night. No response came, but he could feel the weight of unseen eyes. Turning his attention back to the horse, Thomas recognized the distinctive marking on its flank, a white streak shaped like a lightning bolt. His stomach dropped as realization dawned. This wasn't just any thoroughbred. This was Victory Stride, Harrison Blake's prize-winning stallion worth millions. Thomas had seen the horse's picture in the local paper countless times. Why would Blake's horse be tied to the tracks? The question burned in Thomas's mind as he worked at the knots. The ropes were professional grade, the kind used on sailing vessels, not the sort of thing someone would have on hand by chance. This had been planned. It took nearly 20 minutes to free the horse completely. By then, Thomas had radioed updates to dispatch, and they had assured him that emergency services were on their way. The horse, once freed, didn't bolt as Thomas expected. Instead, it stayed close, as if understanding that Thomas had saved it from certain disaster. "You're okay now," Thomas said softly, stroking the animal's neck. "We'll get you home." As Thomas led the horse away from the tracks, his flashlight beam caught something half hidden in the underbrush, a small black device. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was a high-definition camera positioned for a clear view of the tracks. Someone had been recording this. The sick feeling in Thomas's stomach intensified. This wasn't a prank or vandalism. It was something far more calculated and disturbing. Someone had orchestrated this entire scenario and wanted to document it. Police sirens wailed in the distance as Thomas secured Victory Stride to a tree away from the tracks, using his own belt as a makeshift lead. He then returned to the camera, careful not to touch it directly. Evidence, he thought. Whatever game someone was playing, this was evidence. Sheriff Jim Garrison arrived first, his cruiser's headlights cutting through the darkness. Behind him came an animal control vehicle and a local news van. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when it involved something as unusual as a train nearly hitting a prize racehorse. "Walker," the sheriff greeted him, tipping his hat. "Dispatch gave me the outline, but I'd like to hear it from you." As Thomas recounted the events, the sheriff's expression grew increasingly grim. When Thomas showed him the camera, Garrison's face hardened into a mask of anger. "This wasn't random," the sheriff concluded, bagging the camera as evidence. "Someone planned this whole thing." "I saw someone watching from that hillside," Thomas added, pointing to the spot. "They disappeared when I noticed them." The sheriff dispatched deputies to search the area, though Thomas suspected whoever had been there was long gone. As animal control checked over Victory Stride, a woman pushed through the small crowd that had begun to gather. "Where is he? Where's Victory?" Her voice carried authority despite her evident distress. Thomas recognized Dr. Alexandra Reynolds, the veterinarian who cared for most of the high-value horses in the region, including Blake's prized stallion. "He's over here, Dr. Reynolds," Thomas called. "He seems okay, just scared." Alexandra rushed to the horse, her practiced hands checking him for injuries. "Thank God," she breathed, resting her forehead briefly against Victory's neck. "When I got the call, I feared the worst." "Do you have Any idea how Blake's horse ended up tied to the tracks? Sheriff Garrison asked her. Alexandra shook her head, her expression troubled. None whatsoever. Victory should have been secure in his stable at Blake's estate. I was there just yesterday afternoon for his routine checkup. Where is Blake? Thomas asked, suddenly realizing the horse's owner was conspicuously absent. That's a good question, the sheriff said, pulling out his phone. I've been trying to reach him since we got the call, no answer. As if summoned by his name, a sleek black SUV pulled up at the edge of the growing scene. Harrison Blake stepped out, immaculately dressed despite the hour, not a hair out of place. His face was a perfect mask of concern as he approached. I just got the message, Blake announced, his voice carrying easily over the murmurs of the crowd. What happened to my horse? Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night. Something about Blake's demeanor seemed off, too composed, too prepared. As Blake locked eyes with Thomas, a faint smile flickered across the millionaire's face, so quick that Thomas almost thought he'd imagined it. But he hadn't. In that brief moment, Thomas knew with absolute certainty that Harrison Blake was not here by coincidence. The man had orchestrated everything, the horse, the camera, the near disaster. The question was why. As Blake approached Victory's stride with well-practiced concern, making a show of checking his valuable property for injuries, Thomas watched him carefully. Blake's hands moved over the horse with the confidence of ownership, but his eyes kept darting to Thomas, measuring his reactions. The Willow Creek Herald's headline the next morning read, Local hero, train engineer saves millionaire's prize. Horse. The front page photo showed Thomas standing beside Victory's stride, the massive locomotive looming in the background. Thomas tossed the newspaper onto his kitchen table with a sigh. He hadn't wanted this. Attention, Dad. You're famous, Emma exclaimed, grabbing the paper. Her eyes scanned the article quickly, a skill she'd inherited from her father. It says Mr. Blake is offering you a reward of $50,000. Thomas shook his head. I'm not taking his money. But Dad, that's enough for my first year at NYU, Emma pointed out, her practical nature asserting itself. With scholarships, it could cover even more. There's something not right about all this, Emma, Thomas said, pouring himself another cup of coffee. He hadn't slept since the incident, his mind replaying that moment when Blake's eyes had met his, that flash of calculated interest that made Thomas's skin crawl. The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Thomas opened the front door to find Sheriff Garrison standing on his porch, looking as tired as Thomas felt. Morning, Walker, the sheriff said. Got a minute? Thomas invited him in, offered coffee that was gratefully accepted, and introduced the lawman to Emma. The teenager, sensing adult business, excused herself to finish preparing for school. Smart kid, Garrison remarked as Emma disappeared into her room. Takes after her dad. What's going on, Jim? Thomas asked, cutting to the chase. Did you find out anything about that camera? The sheriff's expression tightened. That's partly why I'm here. The camera's gone. Gone? What do you mean gone? It was evidence in a police investigation. Disappeared from the evidence locker sometime during the night shift. The deputy on duty swears no one unauthorized entered the station, but Garrison spread his hands in a gesture of frustration. Thomas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Blake has that kind of influence? I'm not saying anything official, Garrison replied carefully. But you and I both know there are people in this town who do just about anything for the right price, including making evidence vanish. Thomas ran a hand through his hair. So that's it? Blake ties his multi-million-dollar horse to the tracks, nearly causes a major train accident, and just walks away. I didn't say that, Garrison countered. The camera might be gone, but we've still got your statement. The fact that Victory Stride was definitely tied up with specialized knots and a few other things that don't add up in Blake's story. Like what? Like the fact that the night watchman at Blake's stables was suddenly given the night off with double pay. Like the fact that Blake claimed to be at a charity function in Louisville that ended at midnight, but nobody can confirm his whereabouts between then and when he showed up at the scene, and like the fact that someone made a very large anonymous donation to the police retirement fund this morning. Thomas's eyebrows shot up. Is that last one supposed to make me feel better or worse? Garrison gave a humorless laugh. Neither. It's supposed to make you understand what we're dealing with. Blake thinks he can buy his way out of this, just like he buys everything else. But there's one thing he didn't count on. What's that? You! Walker, you're not for sale, and neither am I. The sheriff set down his coffee mug with finality. I'm building a case, but I need time. Meanwhile, Blake's been calling my office every hour, asking for your contact information, says he wants to thank you personally. Thomas snorted. I bet he does. I haven't given it to him, but Willow Creek isn't that big. He'll find you if he wants to. Just be careful what you say to him. After Garrison left, Thomas drove Emma to school, his mind churning with unanswered questions. As he pulled up to the high school entrance, Emma touched his arm. Dad, are you okay? You seem a million miles away. Thomas forced a smile. Just tired, sweetheart. Good luck with your presentation today. Thanks. She hesitated before getting out. About Mr. Blake's reward. We'll talk about it later, Thomas promised, though he had no intention of accepting anything from Harrison Blake. As Emma disappeared into the school building, Thomas checked his watch. His next shift wasn't until tomorrow. The rail company had insisted he take a day off after the incident. With time on his hands and questions burning in his mind, Thomas made a decision. He needed to know more about Harrison Blake. His first stop was the Willow Creek Public Library, where local newspapers were archived going back decades. The librarian, Mrs. Winters, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who had known Thomas since he was a boy, helped him locate materials about Blake. Interesting man, Mr. Blake, she remarked as she laid out stacks of newspapers and magazines. Moved. Here about 7 years ago, bought the old Harrington estate and started renovating before he'd even unpacked. Never does anything halfway, that one. Thomas spent hours poring over articles. Blake had made his fortune in tech investments and hedge funds, though the details were always vague. He donated generously to local causes, the hospital wing, the renovation of the town hall, scholarships for local students. On paper, he was a model citizen. But there were oddities too, references to legal disputes that were suddenly dropped, former business partners who disappeared from public life after falling out with Blake, strange accidents that seemed to befall his competitors. Nothing concrete, nothing prosecutable, but a pattern emerged of convenient coincidences that always benefited Harrison Blake. As Thomas was about to leave, Mrs. Winters approached with one final folder. Found this in the back. These weren't digitized yet. Articles from the Boston Observer from about 10 years ago. Mr. Blake lived there before coming here. The yellowing newspaper clippings told a disturbing story. In Boston, Blake had been involved in what the paper called elaborate pranks among the city's elite. One incident described a charity auction where Blake had somehow engineered a bidding war between two prominent businessmen over a worthless painting, driving the price to over $1 million before revealing the hoax. Another mentioned a social experiment where Blake had pretended to be homeless for a week, secretly filming his wealthy friends' reactions when he approached them for help. The most disturbing article was the last one in the folder, dated just before Blake left Boston. It briefly mentioned an incident involving Blake's prized yacht and a rival businessman's daughter, describing it as a psychological game gone too far. The details were frustratingly vague, but the article concluded with a quote from an unnamed source. Blake doesn't play for money. He plays for the reaction. He wants to see what people will do when pushed to their limits. Thomas left the library with a clearer picture of who he was dealing with, but no real understanding of why Blake would risk his valuable horse in such a dangerous game. As he drove home, his cell phone rang, a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Walker, this is Alexandra Reynolds, the veterinarian from last night." "Dr. Reynolds," Thomas acknowledged, pulling over to take the call. "How's Victory Stride doing?" "That's partly why I'm calling. I'd like to talk to you in person if possible. It's about the horse and about Mr. Blake." They arranged to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, away from curious ears. Dr. Reynolds, "Call me Alex," she insisted, was already there when Thomas arrived, nursing a cup of tea and looking over her shoulder periodically. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as Thomas sat down. "I didn't know who else to talk to." "What's going on?" Alex leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I've been Victory's vet since Blake brought him to Kentucky. That horse is worth over $8 million and has won Blake 3 times that in purses and breeding fees. There's no way Blake would risk that animal's safety." "Unless he had something bigger to gain," Thomas suggested. "Exactly." Alex's green eyes flashed with conviction. "And I think I know what it might be. Have you heard of the Pantheon?" Thomas shook his head. "It's an exclusive club, invitation only, limited to people worth at least $100 million. Blake's been trying to get in for years, but they've rejected him repeatedly. Word is they find him too conventional, too predictable." "Conventional?" Thomas repeated incredulously. "The man tied his horse to railroad tracks." "That's just it," Alex said, glancing around again to ensure no one was listening. "After you left last night, I overheard Blake on the phone. He was talking to someone about proof of concept and a successful test. He mentioned something about the ultimate game and moving to the next level." A chill ran down Thomas's spine. "You think this was some kind of audition for this Pantheon Club?" "It makes a sick kind of sense. The Pantheon is rumored to organize elaborate games for its members, not illegal necessarily, but ethically questionable tests of human behavior. Social experiments, they call them." Thomas remembered the articles from Boston, like seeing how far people will go to save an animal. Alex nodded grimly. "Blake didn't just want to see if you'd stop the train. He wanted to document it. Hence the camera, proof for his application to the Pantheon. But why me? Why my train?" "I don't know," Alex admitted. "Maybe you were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe what? Maybe he chose you specifically. Your perfect safety record is well known in town. Blake does his research." Thomas fell silent, processing this information. If Alex was right, then Blake had not only endangered his horse and a train full of cargo, but had specifically targeted Thomas as part of some twisted game to impress a club of bored billionaires. "There's more," Alex continued hesitantly. "Victory isn't the first animal Blake has used in his games. When I was examining him, I found evidence of a previous incident, a healed injury, consistent with a fall from height. I checked my records, and about 8 months ago, Blake claimed Victory had escaped his stall and injured himself. I treated him then. But now I wonder if that was another experiment," Thomas finished. Alex nodded. "And Blake owns other animals. I've treated his dogs, his exotic birds. If he's willing to risk Victory, his most valuable animal." The implication hung in the air between them. Blake's games might extend far beyond what they had discovered. "We need proof," Thomas said finally. "Something concrete that shows what Blake is doing." "I know," Alex agreed. "That's why I'm telling you this. I can't risk confronting Blake directly. He's my biggest client, and he could ruin my practice with one phone call. But if someone were to look into his activities more closely—" "Someone like the sheriff," Thomas suggested. "Garrison's a good man, but his hands are tied without evidence. The camera's gone, and it would be my word against Blake's about what I overheard." Thomas considered this. What about the Pantheon? If we could prove this club exists and that Blake is trying to join it, it's more rumor than fact, Alex cut in. No official records, no public members, just whispers among the ultra-wealthy. Their conversation was interrupted by Thomas's phone. Emma was calling from school. "Dad?" Her voice sounded odd, strained. "Mr. Blake is here. At school, he's presenting a check for new science equipment, and he asked to meet me. He said he wants to talk about a special scholarship for NYU, full ride, all expenses paid. He knows, Dad. He knows everything about us." Thomas's blood ran cold. "Emma, listen to me. Don't go anywhere alone with him. Stay with your teachers. Stay in public areas. I'm coming to get you right now." As Thomas ended the call, he met Alex's worried gaze. "Blake's making his next move," he said grimly, "and he's using my daughter to do it." "What are you going to do?" Alex asked. Thomas stood, throwing money on the table for their untouched drinks. "Whatever it takes to stop him. This game ends. Now." Thomas's truck screeched to a halt in the Willow Creek High School parking lot. His hands were steady, but his mind raced with scenarios, each worse than the last. Blake was using Emma, using his daughter, as a pawn in whatever game he was playing. The realization burned through Thomas like acid. He found Emma in the principal's office, looking uncomfortable, but unharmed. Harrison Blake sat across from her, his posture relaxed, a practiced smile on his face. Principal Diane Foster hovered nearby, clearly starstruck by the presence of the town's wealthiest resident. "Mr. Walker." Blake stood as Thomas entered, extending his hand as if they were old friends, meeting for lunch. "I was just telling your brilliant daughter about the Blake Foundation's new STEM scholarship program. Full ride to the university of her choice, though I understand NYU is at the top of her list." Thomas ignored the outstretched hand. "Emma, get your things. We're leaving." "But Dad," Emma began, glancing between her father and the millionaire. Mr. Blake was explaining. "Now, Emma," Thomas's tone left no room for argument. "Principal." Foster stepped forward. "Mr. Walker, this is a tremendous opportunity." "It's all right, Diane," Blake interjected smoothly. "Family comes first. We can continue this conversation another time." His eyes locked with Thomas's, that same calculating look from the night before now plainly visible. "Perhaps Mr. Walker and I could meet privately to discuss the details." "There's nothing to discuss," Thomas stated flatly. "Emma won't be accepting any scholarships from you." Blake's smile didn't falter, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "That's a shame. Opportunities like this don't come along every day, especially for working-class families." The condescension in his tone made Thomas's fists clench involuntarily. Emma gathered her backpack, sensing the tension in the room. "Thanks for your time, Mr. Blake," she said politely, ever the diplomat. "And thank you, Principal Foster." As they walked to the truck, Emma waited until they were out of earshot before rounding on her father. "Dad, what was that about? Do you know how much money that scholarship is worth? It's everything we've been working for." Thomas unlocked the truck but didn't get in. "Emma, I need you to trust me on this. Blake isn't offering that scholarship out of the kindness of his heart." "Of course he isn't," Emma rolled her eyes. "It's a tax write-off or good. Publicity or whatever. Who cares why he's doing it? It's a full ride to NYU. "It's more complicated than that," Thomas tried to explain. "Blake was behind what happened last night with the horse." Emma's expression shifted from frustration to confusion. "What do you mean, behind it?" "I thought someone vandalized his property." "No, he did it himself. He tied his own horse to those tracks." Emma stared at her father. That's crazy. Why would anyone do that?" "Because he's playing a game," Thomas said, struggling to make her understand without frightening her. "And now he's trying to involve you in it." "A game? Dad, you're not making any sense." Thomas took a deep breath. "Blake is trying to manipulate me, to manipulate us, for his own entertainment. The scholarship is just bait. Emma's scientific mind engaged with the problem. What evidence do you have? Despite the gravity of the situation, Thomas felt a surge of pride at his daughter's analytical approach. Not enough yet, but I'm working on it with Sheriff Garrison and Dr. Reynolds. The horse vet? Emma's eyebrows rose. Is she part of this too? She's helping me, Thomas clarified. Look, I need you to stay with Aunt Judy for a few days, just until this is sorted out. No way, Emma protested. If something's going on, I want to help. Besides, I have school. The science fair is next week, and their argument was interrupted by Thomas's phone. It was Sheriff Garrison. Walker, the sheriff's voice was tense. We need to talk. My office as soon as possible. I'm with Emma right now. Can it wait? It's about Blake, and it can't wait. 20 minutes later, having dropped a still protesting Emma at his sister's house with strict instructions to stay inside, Thomas sat across from Sheriff Garrison in his office. Alex Reynolds was there too, looking pale. Tell him what you told me, Garrison instructed Alex. After we spoke, she began, her voice strained, I went back to check on Victory Stride. Blake was there with 2 men I didn't recognize, not locals. They were discussing Phase 2 and mentioned something about higher stakes. Blake saw me and cut the conversation short. An hour later, I received this. She slid her phone across the desk. On the screen was an email from the State Veterinary Licensing Board, informing her that an anonymous complaint had been filed against her practice, alleging improper care of animals and prescription drug violations. It's bogus, Alex said bitterly, but they have to investigate. Meanwhile, my practice is under a cloud. Most of my clients will go elsewhere rather than risk their animals. Blake's sending a message, Garrison commented grimly. Cross him, and he'll destroy you. There's more, Alex continued. On my way here, my assistant called. Someone broke into the clinic. The only things taken were my case files on Blake's animals. Thomas felt the knot in his stomach tighten. He's covering his tracks. Exactly, Garrison agreed, but he made a mistake. Alex has digital backups of her records. We found a pattern of suspicious injuries to Blake's animals going back 3 years, all documented, all explained away with plausible accidents. It's not just animals, Thomas realized aloud. The articles from Boston. He's been doing this for years. Playing games with people, manipulating situations to see how others react. The problem is proving it, Garrison said. Everything he does skirts the line of legality. Even with Victory Stride, he could claim the horse escaped, and someone else tied him to the tracks. Thomas leaned forward. What about the Pantheon? Alex mentioned it earlier, an exclusive club Blake is trying to join. Garrison nodded slowly. I made some calls to contacts in larger departments. The Pantheon exists all right. Very secretive, very exclusive. They're not technically doing anything illegal, but they operate in ethical gray areas. Elaborate psychological games that test human behavior, usually involving their vast wealth and influence. And Blake wants in, Thomas concluded. Desperately, Alex confirmed. It's the one club that's rejected him, and from what I've gathered, it's eating him alive. So what do we do? Thomas asked. How do we stop him before someone gets hurt? Garrison exchanged a glance with Alex before answering. We've been discussing that. Blake's too smart to leave evidence, too rich to face normal consequences, but every man has a weakness. And Blake's is his pride, Alex added. His need to impress the Pantheon, to be accepted by those he considers his peers. You want to use that against him, Thomas understood. Set up a game of our own. Exactly, Garrison confirmed, but we need to be careful. Blake is dangerous. When cornered, they spent the next hour outlining a plan, a countergame that would use Blake's own tactics against him. By the time Thomas left the sheriff's office, a sense of purpose had replaced his earlier fear. Blake might have started this game, but they were going to finish it. The next morning, Thomas received a hand-delivered envelope. Inside was an invitation to a private dinner at Blake's estate that evening. Just the two of them, to discuss Emma's future. The implied threat was clear. Thomas called Garrison immediately. Blake made contact. He wants me to come to his house tonight. Perfect, the sheriff replied. That fits our timeline. Alex has already put her part in motion. Thomas spent the day preparing, going over every detail of their plan. He checked on Emma, who was safe at Judy's house, then went home to change for the evening. As he knotted his tie, his only tie, worn to Emma's school functions and the occasional funeral, Thomas steeled himself for the confrontation ahead. Blake's estate was a monument to wealth. Acres of manicured grounds surrounding a mansion that looked like it had been transplanted from the English countryside. A stone-faced butler led Thomas through marble hallways adorned with priceless art to a dining room where Harrison Blake waited alone. "Thomas!" Blake greeted him with false warmth, gesturing to the seat across from him. "May I call you Thomas? I feel like we've developed a certain rapport." "Mr. Blake," Thomas acknowledged, taking the offered seat. "Please call me Harrison." Blake's smile didn't reach his eyes. After all, we might soon be connected through Emma's educational future. "That's what I'm here to discuss," Thomas said carefully. "Your scholarship offer is very generous." "But you have concerns," Blake supplied, signaling a server to pour wine. "Understandable. A gift of that magnitude often causes people to question motives." "And what are your motives, Mr. Blake?" Blake laughed softly. "Direct. I appreciate that. Let's just say I recognize potential in your daughter, and I enjoy nurturing potential." "The way you nurture your horses?" Thomas asked pointedly. A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, crossed Blake's face before his mask of affability returned. "I'm not sure I follow." "I think you do," Thomas replied. Victory stride. The tracks, the camera, the game. Blake studied Thomas for a long moment before a slow smile spread across his face. Different from his earlier practiced charm, this one genuine and far more disturbing. "You've done your homework," Blake acknowledged, swirling his wine. "Most people wouldn't have connected the dots. They'd have simply taken the scholarship and counted themselves lucky." "I'm not most people." "Clearly not," Blake agreed. "That's precisely what makes you so interesting, Thomas. You see, most humans are predictable. They act on basic impulses, greed, fear, self-preservation. But occasionally someone surprises me. You did, when you risked your life for a horse." "I was doing my job," Thomas said flatly. "No," Blake corrected. "Your job was to protect the train and its cargo. Protocol would have dictated a controlled deceleration that would have been too late for victory. You made a choice, a fascinating one, to risk derailment for an animal. Is that why you're targeting my daughter now? To see what choice I'll make?" Blake leaned forward, suddenly intense. "Don't you see? It's all connected. The choices we make define us. I simply create scenarios that reveal truth. You create situations that manipulate people for your entertainment," Thomas countered. "You risk lives, animal and human, for your own amusement." For knowledge," Blake corrected. "For insight into human nature. The Pantheon understands this. They appreciate the value of such experiments." Thomas kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he celebrated. Blake had confirmed his connection to the Pantheon. "And what would the Pantheon think of your methods?" Thomas asked. "Targeting a teenage girl, destroying a veterinarian's practice? Are those the actions of someone worthy of their membership?" Blake's eyes narrowed. "You know about the Pantheon." "I know more than you think," Thomas replied, reaching into his jacket. He placed a small flash drive on the table between them. "Including what's on this." "And what might that be?" Blake's voice remained steady, but a new tension had entered his posture. "Everything," Thomas said simply. Dr. Reynolds's complete records of suspicious injuries to your animals, witness statements about your whereabouts, the night Victory was tied to the tracks, financial records showing payments to the night watchman and to a deputy at the sheriff's office who mysteriously lost evidence. Even footage from a second camera at the railway scene, one you didn't know about, installed by the rail company after recent vandalism. Blake's composure slipped for just a moment. You're bluffing. Am I? Thomas met his gaze steadily. The rail company has cameras at strategic points along the track. They automatically upload to secure servers. Did you really think there would only be your camera recording that night? Blake's hand tightened around his wine glass. What do you want? Money? Name your price. I don't want your money, Thomas said. I want you to leave Willow Creek, sell your property, donate your animals to reputable sanctuaries, and never come back. And I want you to establish that scholarship for Emma through an independent foundation that you have no control over. Or what? Blake challenged. You'll go public? I have an army of lawyers who would bury you in litigation. I won't. And go public, Thomas replied calmly. I'll send this evidence directly to the Pantheon's governing council. Their names and contact information are on that drive too. Blake went very still. How did you... Sheriff Garrison has connections in federal law enforcement. The Pantheon may operate in gray areas, but they're very particular about who they allow into their ranks. They value discretion, calculation, and sophistication. I wonder how they'd react to evidence that you're nothing more than a common bully. Who got caught? For several long moments, Blake said nothing. Thomas could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes, assessing options, weighing possibilities, looking for leverage. You've thought this through, Blake finally acknowledged. I underestimated you. Most people do, Thomas replied simply. Blake leaned back in his chair, a new respect in his gaze. You know, in a different life, you'd have made an excellent Pantheon member yourself. You understand the game better than most. This isn't a game to me, Thomas said, firmly. These are lives, my daughter's life, that you're treating like chess pieces. Blake considered this. What assurance do I have that you'll keep your word? That once I meet your demands, you won't send that evidence anyway? You don't, Thomas admitted. You'll have to trust me, or rather trust that I'm exactly who you think I am. Someone who keeps his word and follows his moral compass. Isn't that what your experiment proved? A slow smile spread across Blake's face, genuine this time, and tinged with something like admiration. Turning my own logic against me. Brilliant. Do we have a deal? Thomas pressed. Blake nodded, once decisively. We do. I'll have my lawyers draw up the paperwork for the scholarship tomorrow, and I'll begin making arrangements to sell the estate. One more thing, Thomas added. Dr. Reynolds, the complaint against her needs to disappear. Easily arranged, Blake agreed. You drive a hard bargain for a train engineer. I'm a father first, Thomas corrected him. As Thomas left the mansion that night, he felt the weight of the past few days lifting from his shoulders. In the parking area, he texted a prearranged message to Sheriff Garrison. Checkmate. 2 weeks later, Thomas stood with Emma at the Willow Creek train station. A gentle spring rain fell, giving the platform a glossy sheen under the station. Lights. You sure you don't want me to drive you? Thomas asked for the third time. Emma rolled her eyes fondly. Dad, it's just Louisville. I'll be back Sunday night. Aunt Judy is meeting me at the station. I know, Thomas conceded. I just worry. You always worry, Emma teased. But I'll be fine. The interview for the foundation scholarship is just a formality now that the paperwork's gone through. And by you, here I come. Thomas smiled, thinking of how much had changed in recent weeks. True to his word, Harrison Blake had established an independent scholarship foundation with enough funding for 10 full-ride scholarships, including Emma's. He'd sold his estate to a horse rescue organization for a fraction of its worth, and quietly left town. Victory Stride had been donated to a therapeutic riding program for children with disabilities. The town had buzzed with rumors about Blake's sudden departure, but the truth of what had happened remained known to only a handful of people. Thomas preferred it that way. "Dad," Emma's voice broke into his thoughts, "you're a million miles away again." "Nee, just thinking about how proud I am of you," Thomas said sincerely. As they embraced, Thomas spotted Alex Reynolds walking toward them carrying 2 coffee cups. Over the past weeks, the veterinarian had become a frequent visitor to the Walker household, initially to update Thomas on the situation with Blake, and later, well, Thomas wasn't exactly sure what to call it yet, but Emma had taken to teasing him about his coffee dates. "Thought you might need this," Alex said, handing him a cup. "Station coffee isn't great, but it's hot." "My hero," Thomas replied, earning a dramatic eye roll from Emma. "You two are ridiculous," the teenager declared. "Alex, please make sure my dad doesn't spend the entire weekend worrying about me." "I'll do my best," Alex promised with a smile. As Emma's train pulled into the station, Thomas felt a curious mix of emotions: pride in his daughter's bright future, relief that Blake's shadow no longer hung over them, and perhaps, just perhaps, a tentative hope for something new with Alex. The train whistle blew, a sound that had once been merely the backdrop to Thomas's daily life, but now carried deeper meaning. It reminded him of choices made in split seconds that revealed character, of courage found in unlikely moments, and of games that could be won by those who refused to play by another's rules. "All aboard," called the conductor. Emma gave her father one final hug. "Love you, Dad. See you Sunday." "Love you too, sweetheart," Thomas replied, watching as his daughter boarded the train that would carry her not just to Louisville, but toward a future now unburdened by financial worry. As the train pulled away, Alex slipped her hand into his. "She's going to change the world, that one." Thomas nodded, allowing himself to enjoy the simple comfort of Alex's presence. "She already has. Mine, at least." Together, they watched the train disappear around the bend, the same bend where, weeks earlier, Thomas had faced a split-second decision that had set everything in motion. Life, he reflected, was full of such moments. Crossroads where character was revealed and futures determined. Some, like Harrison Blake, tried to control those moments, to orchestrate them for their own purposes. But Thomas had learned that the true measure of a person wasn't found in elaborate games or carefully constructed scenarios, but in the quiet courage of everyday choices. The decision to stop a train for a horse, to stand up for a daughter, to open one's heart to new possibilities. As Thomas and Alex walked hand in hand through the gentle rain, the station lights cast their shadows long across the platform, 2 separate silhouettes that somehow, against all odds, had found their way to each other. The game was over. Real life, with all its unpredictable wonder, had just begun. Dear listeners, we hope you were captivated by Thomas and Harrison's battle of wills and the powerful reminder that true character is revealed in our everyday choices. For more emotionally resonant stories that explore the depths of human nature, we've prepared a special playlist you can find by clicking to your left. If this tale of courage and integrity touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that delve into life's complexities and meaningful connections. What would you have done in Thomas's position? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until our next journey together, remember that the most important games are the ones where you stay true to yourself.